Dr. Marcus Webb grabbed Emily's paperback novel and threw it across the break room. It hit the wall and dropped to the floor. "This is a hospital, not a library," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you want to sit and read fairy tales, go home." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You don't belong here." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Every nurse in that room looked away. And Emily Carter looked at the floor where her book had fallen and said absolutely nothing. That silence was about to cost him everything. Subscribe now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. The night shift at Mercy General Hospital in Chicago was the kind of shift that broke people. Not physically. People could recover from physical exhaustion. You slept it off. You ate something hot and real, and you came back the next evening ready to fight again. No. The night shift broke something deeper. It reached into the part of you that believed the work mattered. The part that remembered why you walked through those doors the first time. The part that held on to the idea that suffering could be reduced. That a skilled pair of hands and a clear head and genuine compassion could push back against the worst things that happen to human bodies. After enough night shifts, that part got quiet and then it got small. And then for most people, it disappeared entirely. Emily Carter had been working nights at Mercy General for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She knew the exact number because she kept a small leather journal in the bottom drawer of her locker. And every morning before she drove home, she wrote the date in a single sentence. Not about what happened, not about the patients, just one honest sentence about how she felt. Most of those sentences were only 4 words long. Still here, still whole. That was enough. The ER floor where Emily worked was organized chaos on a good night and absolute warfare on a bad one. Chicago in November meant drunk drivers, and domestic calls and GSW after GSW rolling through the ambulance bay before midnight. The triage nurses were fierce and experienced women who had seen everything, and still somehow managed to care about what they were seeing. The attending physicians ranged from brilliant to burned out. The residents ranged from dangerous to terrified. And then there were people like Marcus Webb. Dr. Marcus Webb was 29 years old, freshly minted from a prestigious residency at Northwestern, and he moved through the emergency department like a man who had been told since birth that rooms existed to accommodate him. He was tall and broad-shouldered and handsome in a way that had probably opened doors for him his entire life. He was also technically gifted. Emily had watched him work. She could see it clearly. The precision in his hands, the quickness of his clinical thinking, the way he moved during a trauma activation with real authority. But somewhere between his talent and his character, something had gone badly wrong. Marcus Webb treated nurses the way some people treated furniture. Useful when needed, invisible the rest of the time, and occasionally when stressed or frustrated or simply bored, he treated them worse than that. He had a habit of performing his worst behavior in front of audiences. He seemed to understand instinctively that humiliation required witnesses. A correction delivered privately was just a correction. A correction delivered loudly in the middle of a shift while 4 interns and 3 nurses and a family of worried relatives stood watching. That was something else entirely. That was a statement about hierarchy, about who mattered and who didn't. Emily had been on the receiving end of Marcus Webb's statements more than once. The first time was in her second week at Mercy General when she handed him the wrong gauge IV line during a fast-moving trauma and he turned to the room and said, "Does anyone know why we don't let people who can't read labels into our trauma bays?" She said nothing. She got the correct line. The patient was stabilized. The second time was when she asked a question about a post-operative patient's medication protocol, and he looked at her with something close to genuine confusion, like he was trying to understand why a nurse was speaking to him at all. "I'll explain it slowly," he said, "since clearly that's what's needed here." The intern standing beside him laughed. Emily wrote the information down and administered the medication correctly. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth times blurred together after a while. What didn't blur was Emily's response, which was always the same. She did not argue, she did not cry, and she did not file complaints or vent to colleagues in the break room or leave passive-aggressive notes in the communication log. She simply continued doing her job with the same precise, unhurried competence she brought to every task. This infuriated Marcus Webb in a way he couldn't entirely explain. He had dealt with nurses who fought back and he knew how to handle them. He had dealt with nurses who crumbled and he knew how to handle that too. But Emily Carter refused to do either, and her refusal felt like a judgment he hadn't asked for and couldn't dismiss. He found himself watching her sometimes between patients when the floor was briefly quiet. She moved differently from the other nurses. Not quickly exactly, but efficiently in a way that eliminated wasted motion entirely. When she started an IV line, it was in the vein on the first attempt, always without the searching hesitation that most nurses showed. When she assessed a trauma patient coming off the ambulance bay, she did it in a sequence so practiced it looked like choreography, hands moving across the body in a pattern so logical and complete that she often caught things before the attending had even crossed the room. Once during a particularly brutal Saturday night in October, a patient had come in with what the paramedics were calling a simple laceration. Marcus had glanced at the chart, logged a quick assessment, and moved on. Emily had stopped the man before he was transferred to a minor treatment room and said quietly, "His left pupil is tracking differently than his right." She said it to nobody in particular, really just said it into the air. Marcus had turned around. He had looked and the man had been rushed to CT where they found a subdural hematoma that would have killed him before morning. Marcus Webb had not thanked her. He had not acknowledged what she had done at all. But he had thought about it later in the parking garage, sitting in his car in the dark at 4:00 a.m. He had sat there longer than he intended thinking about those eyes of hers. The way she had looked at that patient like she was reading something written in a language nobody else in the building spoke. He didn't like how that made him feel, so he came back the next shift and was worse to her than ever. The break room at Mercy General was a small, badly lit space at the far end of the ER corridor. It had 2 tables, a collection of mismatched chairs, a coffee machine that worked approximately 60% of the time, and a bulletin board covered in cartoons and policy memos, and a sign someone had put up in 2019 that said, "Wash your hands," in bright red letters. As if that needed to be said in the hospital. Emily took her breaks alone, not because nobody would sit with her, but because she had learned over years that what she needed during the 15 or 20 minutes she was allowed to stop was not conversation. It was silence. Real silence, the kind where her brain could release its grip on the constant surveillance she maintained over everything happening around her. The monitoring she couldn't fully switch off even when she tried. She read paperback novels, old ones mostly, the kind with creased spines and pages gone yellow at the edges, bought from boxes at church sales and thrift shops. Mysteries mostly, though she wasn't particularly invested in the plots. She liked the rhythm of a certain kind of writing, the short sentences, the action moving forward without hesitation. She was reading one of these novels on a Tuesday night in November when Dr. Marcus Webb walked into the break room at 11:47 p.m. still wearing his trauma gown and made the comment about people sitting and reading while others were dying. He said it to the room. He looked at her when he said it. Several people heard. A few laughed. Emily turned to Paige. "I'm talking to you." Marcus said. Emily looked up, then not with anger, not with fear. She looked at him with an expression that several people who were present that night would later describe when telling the story as simply flat, like a wall, like a surface nothing could stick to. "I heard you," she said. "Then why aren't you out on the floor?" "Because my break started 4 minutes ago and it ends in 11 minutes. She looked back at her book. "I'll be out at 12:02. Marcus opened his mouth, and then the doors from the ambulance bay burst open and a paramedic was shouting, and the entire room moved and Marcus Webb moved with it, and Emily carefully placed her bookmark between pages 147 and 148, set the novel on the table and walked out to do her job. 12:02 exactly. She would think about that small private satisfaction later when everything else had happened. When her world had been turned inside out, and her carefully constructed life had been shattered beyond reassembly, she would think about the book on the table, the bookmark holding her place. The quiet, rebellious dignity of finishing her break before responding to a man who didn't deserve the breath it took to argue with him. It would feel like the last normal thing she ever did. The patient who came in through the ambulance bay that night was a 17-year-old boy named Deshaun Williams, and he was dying. Stab wound 2 in below the left clavicle in an area that looked less dangerous than it w. As the paramedics had packed it and applied pressure and moved fast, but Deshaun's pressure was dropping and his color was wrong. And when Emily looked at his face as they wheeled him past, she saw something that nobody else on the floor seemed to notice. She stepped up alongside the gurney. "What's his map?" she asked the paramedic. 62 and falling. She put her hand on Deshaun's forearm, not to check his pulse, to feel the temperature of his skin. Then she leaned close and looked at the wound dressing. "Get Webb," she said to nobody specifically. "He's already so young." "Get him now," Emily said. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't shake, but something in it made the triage nurse turn immediately and call out for Marcus Webb without asking why. Marcus came around the corner with his signature expression of barely contained impatience. "With the wound angle," Emily said, "amuse him. It's not tracking toward the lung." She held Deshaun's arm up and turned it slightly. "The angle of entry in his body position when it happened. Look at the entry site. This is tracking toward his heart." Marcus stared at her. "That's a lot of extrapolation from he's been tachycardic since arrival and his neck veins are distending." Emily said it flatly, factually. "Beck's triad is developing. He needs a pericardioentesis." The room went still. Beck's triad, the textbook presentation of cardiac tamponade, blood filling the sac around the heart until the heart couldn't beat. It was rare, it was fast, and it was almost always fatal if you didn't catch it exactly right at exactly the right moment. Marcus looked at Deshaun, he looked at the monitor, he looked at the distending neck veins Emily had named. He said nothing for 3 full seconds, then he said, "Get me a pericardioentesis kit," and he saved that boy's life. Afterward, when Deshaun was stable and heading upstairs and the ER had settled into its usual breathless rhythm, Marcus Webb stood in the supply corridor alone. He was stripping his gloves off methodically, the way you did when you needed to do something with your hands to avoid thinking about what had just happened. Emily walked past. She was heading back to the nurse's station, chart in hand, already moving on to the next thing, the way she always moved forward, efficient without drama. Marcus said, "Carter." She stopped, turned. He looked at her for a long moment. There were things he could have said, things he probably should have said if he had been a different kind of man in a different kind of mood after a different kind of life. He could have said, "Thank you." He could have said, "Good catch." He could have said something that acknowledged the reality of what had just happened between them. Instead, he said, "How did you know?" Emily looked at him steadily because I was paying attention. She walked away and Marcus Webb stood in the supply corridor for another full minute alone with what that meant. There were other nurses at Mercy General who had noticed Emily Carter, even if they couldn't have articulated exactly what they had noticed. Rosa Mendes, who had worked the ER for 11 years and seen approximately everything, had started watching Emily 3 months after the woman arrived. Not suspiciously, exactly. More like the way you watched a plant in someone's office that seemed to be growing faster than plants usually grew, and you kept waiting to understand why. "She don't waste nothing," Rosa had said once to her friend and colleague Janet Park while they were both charting at the nurse's station during a rare 20-minute lull. "Every move she makes is the right move. First time every time. You know how long you got to be doing this job before you get that." Janet had looked across the floor to where Emily was assessing a new patient in Bay 3. Maybe she just experienced. "I've been doing this 11 years, Rosa said. I still waste moves, I still second guess." "She don't second guess nothing." Rosa paused watching. "It's almost like she learned this somewhere else, somewhere the second guess could kill you." Janet thought about that for a second, then she looked at Rosa. "You think she's got secrets?" Rosa laughed softly. "Baby, everybody's got secrets, but that woman's secrets got secrets." They hadn't said anything more about it. There was always another patient and another chart and another alarm pulling attention elsewhere. That was the thing about working the ER. The volume of it, the relentlessness meant that even the things you noticed got filed away and forgotten, buried under the weight of what was immediately in front of you. Rosa would remember that conversation later in vivid, almost painful detail, because what happened next was the kind of thing that made you look back and understand you had been standing at the edge of something enormous not knowing it was there. It was a Wednesday night 2 weeks after Deshaun Williams nearly died from cardiac tamponade, and the ER was at its typical Wednesday night tempo. Busy but manageable. No major traumas in the last 40 minutes. Emily was at the nurse's station completing discharge paperwork for an elderly man with a respiratory infection. She had her pen moving steadily across the forms, efficient as always, and she was almost imperceptibly humming something very low and very quiet that nobody could quite identify. Rosa was 3 FT away charting. Janet was answering phones. Marcus Webb was in Bay 6 with a diabetic patient. And then the building shook. It wasn't an earthquake. They all knew what an earthquake felt like or thought they did. The rolling uncertainty of the ground beneath you. This was different. This was a percussion from above, rhythmic and enormous. The deep throbbing beat of heavy rotor blades getting louder by the second, and the windows at the far end of the ER corridor trembled in their frames and the overhead fluorescents flickered once twice, and the whole building seemed to hold its breath. "What is that?" Janet said, standing up from the phone. Nobody answered because nobody knew. The sound got louder, closer. It was directly above them now, massive and mechanical and purposeful, not passing but descending, settling, and then there was a sound like controlled thunder as something enormous landed on the roof of the parking structure adjacent to the ER. "That's a helicopter," Rosa said. "That's a military helicopter," Emily said. Her voice was perfectly flat. And then both front doors of the ER blew open simultaneously, and 4 people in military combat attire came through them at a controlled sprint. And one of them, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years being completely unable to waste a single movement, was already calling out before he had fully cleared the doorway. "We need Emily Carter," he said. "Where is Emily Carter?" The ER floor went completely silent. Every nurse, every doctor, every orderly and technician and waiting patient turned toward the sound of that voice, and then turned toward each other and then began looking around the room in the universal human gesture of trying to identify someone whose presence had just become urgently, militarily, thunderously important. Marcus Webb came out of Base 6. He looked at the soldiers. He looked at his nursing staff. His eyes landed on Emily. She had not moved. She was still standing at the nurse's station, pen and hand discharge form on the counter in front of her. But she was no longer looking at the form. She was looking at the soldiers, and her face had done something that nobody in the ER had ever seen it do before. The flatness was gone. In its place was something complicated and old. An expression that combined recognition and resignation, and something that might have been under different circumstances, relief. The broad-shouldered soldier saw her. Their eyes met across the length of the ER floor. "Major Carter," he said, and Emily Carter closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, something had shifted. Something had returned. Something that had been dormant for 3 years. 2 months and 11 days came back online, in her face like a system rebooting after a long sleep. And the woman who turned to face the soldiers was recognizable as Emily Carter, but also somehow not entirely the same person who had been standing there 30 seconds before. She set the pen down. She set it down carefully, precisely aligned with the edge of the form, and she looked at the soldier who had called her by her rank, and she said in a voice that was quiet and complete, and carried the weight of something enormous, "Sergeant Calloway, how bad?" Oh, Calloway didn't hesitate. "Critical 2 hours, maybe less." "Who authorized the breach protocol?" "Director Morrison himself." Something moved across Emily's face, a shadow fast and gone. "Morrison is alive for now," Calloway said. "That's why we're here." Marcus Webb had not moved. He was standing in the middle of the ER floor, still in his trauma gown, and he was looking at Emily Carter with an expression that his colleagues would later agree they had never seen on his face before. Not confusion exactly, something deeper than confusion. Something that looked like a man trying to recalculate everything he thought he understood about the world around him. "Carter," he said slowly. She turned and looked at him. "Who are you?" he said. Emily looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Sergeant Calloway, then she looked back at Marcus, and when she spoke her voice was the same as it always was, calm, direct, without performance. "The same person I was an hour ago," she said. "I just had a different job before this one." Rosa Mendes, who would tell this story for the rest of her life to anyone who would listen, said later that the air in the room changed in that moment. That something shifted that couldn't be explained. That every person on that floor simultaneously understood they were watching a story they had been living inside without knowing. A story that had been building for 3 years in quiet corners and small, precise movements, and a woman reading paperback novels alone during her break. They had been sharing a building with someone extraordinary and they had not known and she had not told them. And now the world outside had arrived to collect what it was owed. The soldier Calloway stepped forward. "Major, we need to move." Emily nodded once. She reached down and picked up the discharge form she had been working on. She set it in front of Janet Park. "Room 12, Mr. Hadley. He needs the antibiotic script before he leaves. His daughter's in the waiting room. She'll drive him home." She paused. "Make sure she has his follow-up appointment written down. He'll forget to ask." Janet stared at her. "Emily, he'll forget." Emily repeated gently. "He's been alone since his wife died and he doesn't want to be a burden, so he won't ask for anything. Make sure he has everything he needs before he walks out." She picked up her jacket from the hook behind the nurse's station. She did not take her paperback novel. She did not take her locker key. She stood in the middle of the ER floor for one moment, and she looked around at the faces of the people she had worked beside for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, all of them staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to awe to something approaching grief. Her eyes landed on Rosa. "You were right," Emily said quietly. Rosa blinked. "What?" "Whatever you figured out about me." Emily's voice was soft. "You were right." Rosa felt something press against the back of her throat that wasn't quite crying. "Girl," she managed. "What is happening right now?" Emily looked at the soldiers. She looked at the door. She looked briefly, barely, at Marcus Webb, who had not moved from the middle of the floor and was still wearing an expression of absolute fundamental recalibration. And she said nothing else. She simply walked toward Calloway. And as she moved, the entire posture of her body changed. The slight relaxation she had carried in her shoulders during 3 years of night shifts straightened into something military and deliberate. Her stride lengthened. Her chin came up fractionally. Her eyes went forward and steady in a way that was not aggressive, but was unmistakably the gaze of someone who had learned to look directly at dangerous things without flinching. The nurses at the station stood in a row and watched. The intern stood frozen. Marcus Webb stood in the middle of his own floor and watched Emily Carter walk through his like she owned it. Except that wasn't quite right either, because she didn't walk like she owned it. She walked like ownership had never been relevant to her in the first place, like she had simply been borrowing the space for a while and now she had somewhere else to be. Calloway held the door. Emily walked through it. And the last thing Rosa Mendes saw before the door swung shut was Emily Carter stepping into the cold night air beside a soldier, turning her face upward toward the sound of the helicopter on the parking structure roof. And for one single moment in the harsh white light from the landing zone above, she looked like a woman walking back towards something she should never have tried to leave. Then the door closed and the ER was silent. And Marcus Webb stood in the middle of the floor with his trauma gloves still on his hands. And he said to no one in particular, in a voice that was stripped of every bit of the arrogance and performance in manufactured authority he usually wore like armor, a voice that was honestly, genuinely small. He said, "What just happened?" Nobody answered him because nobody knew. Not the full answer, not yet. But in the parking structure above them, rotors were turning. And Major Emily Carter, who had spent 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days pretending to be someone ordinary, was already gone. The rooftop door of the parking structure slammed shut behind Emily, and the cold Chicago air hit her face like a slap. Calloway was already moving ahead of her, his boots loud and purposeful on the concrete, and 2 other soldiers flanked her on both sides without being asked, a protective formation so automatic. It was muscle memory for all 3 of them. Emily matched their pace exactly. No hesitation, no stumble, like her body remembered this even when her mind had spent 3 years trying to forget it. The Blackhawk sat on the rooftop pad with its rotors still turning, impatient and enormous. And the downdraft from the blades pressed Emily's scrub top flat against her chest and pulled her hair sideways across her face. She didn't reach up to push it back. She just kept walking. Calloway reached the helicopter first and turned, holding out a hand to help her board. She didn't take it. She grabbed the handle inside the door frame and pulled herself up in one clean motion. The way you learn to do it after the 14th or 15th time, when the novelty of the machine wore off and it beck. Aim, just another way to get from one terrible place to another. She sat down, buckled in, and for the first time since the soldiers had walked through the ER doors, she let herself look at the man already sitting across from her inside the aircraft. Colonel Daniel Harrow, 53 years old, gray at the temples, deeper lines around his eyes than she remembered. but the same steady gaze that had once looked at her across a field hospital in Kandahar and said without ceremony, "You just saved 9 lives in 4 hours. I'm putting your name in for a commendation." She had told him she didn't want a commendation. He had submitted it anyway. "Emily," he said. "Don't," she said. He closed his mouth. The helicopter lifted. Chicago dropped away beneath them, all lit glass and dark streets, and Emily looked out the window for exactly 3 seconds before she turned back to Harrove and said, "Tell me everything. Start with how Morrison got hit." Harrove leaned forward. "Covert extraction near the Canadian border. We had solid intelligence, or we thought we did. The op was clean until the last mile. Someone burned the road." He paused. "Sniper 2 shots. First one missed. Second one didn't enter left of center. Shattered 2 ribs fragmented inside the chest cavity. Lung involvement or right lung is partially collapsed. The bigger problem is a fragment sitting against the posterior wall of the aorta." Harrove looked at her steadily. "Military surgeons at the Forward facility opened him up and closed him back immediately. They said removing the fragment under those conditions would kill him faster than leaving it." Emily said nothing for a moment. The helicopter shook through a pocket of wind, and neither of them reacted. "What's his current pressure?" "Last reading was 80/50 and dropping. He's been on vasopressors for 6 hours. How long ago did they close him?" 4 hours. Emily looked at the ceiling of the helicopter, not with despair, with the focused inward expression of someone running calculations nobody else in the room could see. Harrove had seen that look before. He had spent years being grateful for it. "Who else have you called?" she asked. 3 vascular surgeons, 2 cardiac specialists, the best military trauma team we have operational right now." He paused. "They all said the same thing, that it's not survivable, that nobody with a specific skill set required is available." He looked at her. "Except you." The helicopter banked left and Emily felt the familiar tilt in her stomach. The physical memory of how many times she had been, say, inside a machine like this one, moving towards something terrible. "You know, I've been out for 3 years." She said. "I know my certification lapsed." "I know that too. You're asking me to perform classified surgical procedure 47 on a man who has been in systemic shock for 6 hours in a facility I've never worked in, on a patient I've never treated." "Yes," Hargrove said simply. Emily looked at him. "Why do you think I can still do this?" Harrove reached into the bag at his feet and pulled out a thin manila folder. He held it out to her. She took it, opened it, and looked at the single page inside. It was a printed scan of a handwritten page. Her handwriting: "Notes from a case in Canada 2019. Patient vitals, wound assessment," a series of margin calculations that looked more like engineering than medicine. "Because that procedure," Hargrove said, "the one the military surgeons said was impossible tonight. You wrote the protocol for it, you tested it. You performed it successfully under active fire with no anesthesiologist, inadequate lighting, and a patient who had already flatlined twice." He paused. "You named it, you documented it. That protocol is the reason 3 men who should have died are alive today. And Morrison knows that, which is why before he lost consciousness his exact words were..." Hargrove paused and looked directly at Emily. "Find Carter, only Carter." The folder sat in Emily's hands and she looked at it, and something moved across her face. Something raw and unguarded there for just a second before she pressed it back down. She closed the folder. She handed it back to Hargrove. "How long until we land?" she said. 18 minutes, she nodded. "Then start talking me through the imaging, everything you have." Calloway, sitting to her right, pulled out a tablet without being asked and handed it across. The first CT scan image filled the screen and Emily held it up toward the cabin light, and her eyes went into that mode. The one that was not quite human in its precision. The one that had made soldiers in Kandahar stop calling her by her name and start calling her something else entirely. Something that had followed her across continents and years, and her own desperate attempt to become ordinary. The Angel of Kandahar. She had hated that name the first time she heard it. It felt like a weight, like something you couldn't carry and couldn't put down. She had heard a young corporal say it reverently in a field hospital. Allen 2018, when she had opened a man's chest cavity with instruments that were inadequate for the task and done what needed doing anyway. And the man had lived, and the corporal had looked at her like she was something that shouldn't exist in the physical world. She had told the corporal to stop. He had nodded and gone back to his post and told everyone he knew. The name followed her home. It followed her into the silence after the mission that broke everything. It sat outside the door of the apartment she rented in Evanston when she first came back. And it sat outside the door of the locker she kept at Mercy General. And it sat outside the break room where she read old paperbacks alone, and she had managed mostly to pretend it wasn't there until tonight. She looked at the CT scan. She looked at the fragment. She looked at the precise, terrible angle of it against the aortic wall, and she thought about 6 hours of shock and a partial lung collapse and vasopressors, and a man who had once looked her in the eye in a briefing room in Virginia and said, "I need someone on this op who won't break," and had chosen her and had been right to choose her, and had come home from that mission in a box along with 11 others, while Emily walked out of the wreckage with shrapnel in her left shoulder and guilt in every cell of her body. That was the mission, the one that ended everything. She had never told anyone the full story of what happened that day. The official report said equipment failure and enemy contact. The official report said Major Emily Carter performed heroically under impossible conditions and should not be held responsible for outcomes beyond her control. The official report was accurate in every factual detail, and missed the entire point of what actually happened the way official reports always did. What actually happened lived in Emily's chest like a second heartbeat, quieter than the first but always there. Carter, Calloway's voice beside her, "You still with us?" She looked at him. "I'm here." She handed the tablet back. "He needs a left lateral thoracotomy to access the fragment from the posterior approach. If his pressure drops below 70 systolic during the procedure, we pack and pause. No heroics." She looked at Harrove. "I need a full surgical team, not military medics, real anesthesiology, real perfusion support. The facility has it," Harrove said, "and I need someone who can assist, who actually knows what they're doing, not someone impressive on paper. Someone who can follow instructions under pressure without asking questions or making decisions I didn't authorize. We have Dr. Reeves on standby." Emily paused. "James Reeves, you know him. He trained under Kowalski at Johns Hopkins. He's good." She thought for a second. "He asked too many questions." Harrove almost smiled. "I'll tell him you said that. Tell him I said do what I say when I say it and ask questions afterward." "Understood." The helicopter began its descent and Emily felt a familiar drop in her stomach and she breathed through it, and in the 15 seconds it took to touch down on the landing pad of the military medical facility outside Chicago, she performed the private ritual. She had always performed before a procedure that mattered. She thought about every patient she had lost. She thought about their faces, the specific individual faces, not as a punishment but as a reminder. These were real people. This was a real life. The skill in her hands was not hers to be proud of. It was hers to spend as completely and precisely as necessary in service of the person on the table. Then the wheels touched down and she was moving before the rotor stopped. The facility was a converted federal building, the kind that had no signage and no public presence, and hummed with a specific quality of controlled urgency that Emily recognized from her years of moving through spaces where classified things happened. Two people in scrubs were waiting at the landing pad entrance, and they fell into step beside her without introduction. "Or two is prepped," the taller one said. A woman mid-40s with the compact efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. "Patient is intubated. Lines are in. We're running a final echo now. What's the ejection fraction?" 38%. Emily processed that without breaking stride. 38 was low, not unsurvivable, but it told her the heart was already struggling, that 6 hours of shock had taken a measurable toll on the muscle itself. "Get me the latest echo images before I scrub. I want to see exactly what the wall motion looks like on the posterior segment." "Already pulled." They moved through 2 security checkpoints and Emily didn't slow down for either one. Just held her wrist to the scanner the way the female surgeon indicated, and the doors opened and they kept moving. The corridor was bright and long and smelled like every medical facility smelled, the specific antiseptic and recycled air smell that Emily had once tried to leave behind and now be like oxygen. At the scrub sink outside O2, Dr. James Reeves was waiting. He was 41 years old, slightly built, with the kind of eyes that moved quickly and cataloged everything. He looked at Emily with an expression that was 1/3 professional assessment and 2/3 something much harder to name. "Major Carter," he said. "Dr. Reeves." She turned on the water. "What's your read on the fragment position?" He blinked. He had clearly expected a greeting, a moment of reestablishment, some acknowledgement of the circumstances. He adjusted quickly. "The fragment is sitting at approximately the 400 position on the posterior aortic wall. There's no active extravasation on the last imaging, which means it hasn't moved, but the wall around it is compromised. Any movement of the patient, any significant pressure change, it migrates and he bleeds out in under 90 seconds. Emily said, "Yes, what's your preferred approach for the posterior access?" He looked at her left thoracic fifth intercostal space. "Sixth," Emily said. "The angle of the fragment means the sixth gives better visualization without having to retract against the lung. The lung is already compromised, we don't add to that." She looked at him. "Are you comfortable with the sixth?" A half-second pause. "Yes, good, then we agree." She reached for the scrub brush. "And Dr. Reeves, I was told you ask a lot of questions." He had the self-awareness to look slightly embarrassed. "I've been told that questions after," Emily said. "During you do what I say. If you disagree, say one word, I'll hear it, but I make the final call." She looked at him. "Are we clear?" "Completely," he said, and something in his voice had shifted, some professional pride rearranging itself into something more like respect. They scrubbed in silence for 90 seconds. Then Reeves said quietly, "I read your protocol, procedure 47. I read the original paper." Emily kept scrubbing. "And I've read a lot of surgical literature," he said carefully. "That paper, as it reads, like it was written by someone who had done things that shouldn't have been possible. Most things that get done were impossible before someone did them. The case in Kandahar that anchored the protocol, patient who flatlined twice, active fire, no anesthesiologist." He paused. "That was you." Emily looked at him over the scrub sink. "Yes, how?" She considered the question. "Because he wasn't finished yet," she said simply, "and I wasn't willing to let him be." She turned off the water with her elbow and held her hands up, and the scrub tech pushed through the O door, and Emily walked through it, and the room beyond was bright and focused, and the patient on the table was CIA Director Alan Morrison, 61 years old, father of 2, the man who had once chosen Emily Carter for a mission that changed everything. And he was gray and still and hooked to machines that were doing the work his body could no longer do alone. She stood at the table and looked at him for exactly 5 seconds. Then she said, "All right, let's begin." And the room moved. The anesthesiologist confirmed sedation depth. The perfusionist confirmed bypass readiness. The scrub tech laid out the instrument tray and Emily looked at it and made 3 adjustments, moving instruments to positions that matched the precise geography of how she worked. Reeves positioned himself across the table and watched her hands with an expression of focused attention that was exactly what she needed from him. Incision, Emily said. The scalpel was in her hand, and everything that Emily Carter had tried to leave behind, the rank, the training, the years of operating in conditions that would have broken most people before the first hour, all of it came back. Not like a flood, but like a tide, inevitable. And right, the return of something that had never truly left, only gone quiet, only waited patient and certain for the moment when it would be needed again. 22 minutes into the procedure, she found the fragment. It was exactly where the imaging said it would be, exactly as dangerous as she had calculated, sitting against the aortic wall like a small, deliberate catastrophe, waiting for permission to happen. The room was silent in the specific way that operating rooms went silent when everyone present understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether the patient lived or died. Emily's hands were absolutely still. Pressure. She said 74 systolic. The anesthesiologist said above the minimum, barely. She had 4, maybe 5 minutes of workable conditions before the numbers moved in a direction she couldn't reverse. Dr. Reeves. She said, when I remove the fragment, you're going to feel the urge to react to what you see. Don't keep your retractors exactly where they are regardless of what happens. Can you do that? Reeves met her eyes across the table. Yes, good. She positioned the forceps. She breathed once and she moved. The fragment came free in a single motion, smooth and certain. And the arterial wall gave a response that Reeves pulled in a sharp breath he couldn't suppress, because what he saw in that moment was the kind of bleeding that ended things fast and absolute, a wall of red that said game over in every language medicine spoke. But Emily's other hand was already moving. The graft placement she had prepared, the suture technique she had developed in a field hospital years ago, when she had nothing but inadequate tools, and a soldier dying beneath her hands, came out of her fingers with a precision that wasn't speed exactly, but was something better than speed. Something that understood the geometry of the problem so completely that every movement was the right one. 30 seconds 45. Reeves was holding his retractors exactly where she had told him to hold them. His knuckles were white, his eyes were locked on her hands. Later, he would say that watching Emily Carter work in that moment was like watching someone do something that existed outside the normal categories of human skill, that it wasn't expertise he was witnessing. Exactly. That expertise was a word that didn't quite reach it. Pressure, Emily said, her voice level. 71, hold, another 20 seconds. 68, hold. The graph was seated. The sutures were running. The bleeding was changing, slowing the physics of it, shifting from catastrophe to something manageable, something workable, something that a skilled pair of hands and a clear head and a refusal to accept the verdict of the impossible could address. 65. Emily did not stop. She did not pause. She did not look up. Her hands moved in the silence with a certainty that was beyond confidence, that had traveled past confidence into something that didn't have a clinical name. Something that was forged not in textbooks or simulations, but in field hospitals and firefights, and the long, specific education of being the last thing standing between death and someone who wasn't ready to go. Pressure is climbing, the anesthesiologist said, and his voice had something in it that didn't belong in an O, something that sounded almost like wonder. 72-76. Reeves exhaled. 81, the anesthesiologist said, holding. Emily placed the final suture. She straightened, she looked at the field, she looked at the monitor. She looked at Alan Morrison's face, gray and still and alive, and she said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then she said, close him. And she stepped back from the table and she stood in the bright, terrible light of the O, and she breathed, and somewhere underneath the controlled surface of everything she was presenting to the room, something shifted. Something that had been held rigid for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days moved a fraction of an inch towards something it hadn't been allowed to be in a very long time. Not pride, not relief. Something more complicated. Something that sounded, if you listen closely enough, like the quietest possible acknowledgement that some things could not be outrun forever. That some people were shaped by their history in ways that 3 years of paperback novels and night shifts in deliberately ordinary existence could postpone but not erase. She walked to the scrub sink outside the O, and she turned on the water and she washed blood from her hands in the silence of a quarter where nobody was watching. And for the first time in 3 years, Major Emily Carter did not feel like someone pretending to be a nurse. She felt like herself, which was the most frightening thing that had happened to her all night. The water ran clear over her hands, and Emily stood at that sink longer than she needed to, not because the blood was stubborn, because the quiet was. After the sustained compression of the last 2 hours, the focused tunnel of the O, the silence of the corridor felt almost too large, like a room she didn't know how to furnish anymore. Reeves came out of the O 12 minutes later. He pulled his mask down and stood beside her and didn't say anything immediately, which told her he was someone who understood that some moments needed a second before words entered them. Then he said, he's stable. Pressure is holding at 88/60. The anesthesiologist is calling it a successful outcome. Emily dried her hands. It's a successful first hour. Successful outcome is 72 hours from now. I know. Reeves paused. But you should know that nobody in that room believed it was possible when you started, including me. He looked at her directly. I was wrong. Emily looked at him. There was nothing performative in his face. No flattery, just a man who had seen something he hadn't expected and was honest enough to say so. You held your retractors exactly right, she said. Under that kind of pressure, that's not nothing. He almost smiled. You told me not to react. I tell a lot of people things, Emily said. Well, most of them react anyway. She set the towel down and Harov was already at the end of the corridor walking toward her with a specific pace of someone who had more information and less time than he wanted. Morrison's family has been notified he's stable, Harov said, stopping in front of her. The director of national intelligence has been briefed. There will be a full debrief in 40 minutes. He paused. And there's something else. Emily waited. The sniper who hit Morrison, we have a preliminary ID. Harov's voice dropped not from discretion but from the weight of what he was saying. His name is Vasily Orov, former FSB. He's been operating on contract for the last 18 months. Another pause. He was on the mission roster 3 years ago. The operation that I know who he was, Emily said. The corridor was very quiet. He was part of your unit, Hargrove said. He was the intelligence liaison attached to my unit. Emily said, there's a difference. Emily, there is a difference, Daniel. Her voice was controlled, completely controlled. But Reeves, standing 3 ft away, felt the temperature of the conversation change in a way that had nothing to do with the building's ventilation. He was never one of us. I said that before the mission. I said it in writing. The record exists. I know the record exists. Then why are you looking at me like I should be surprised? Harov met her eyes. Because he's here, he said, in Chicago. The hit on Morrison wasn't random and it wasn't just a contract. Our analysts believe Morrison was specifically targeted because of what he knows. A beat about what happened on that mission. The information landed in Emily like a stone dropped into still water. Concentric rings spreading outward from the point of impact, touching everything. She stood with it for 3 full seconds, letting it settle, letting her brain do what her brain did, which was assess and calculate without the luxury of falling apart first. He's tying up loose ends, she said. That's the current assessment. Yes, and I'm a loose end. Harov didn't answer, which was its own answer. How long have you known? Emily said, we confirmed his identity 4 hours ago. That's why you came for me personally. She looked at Hargrove steadily, not just because of Morrison. You needed me somewhere you could control the perimeter. Hargrove looked tired. Not guilty exactly, but tired in the specific way of a man who had made a decision he believed was right and was now standing in front of the person most affected by it. You were exposed, Emily. Your address, your cover, your workplace. If Orlov has been building this op for months, he's had time to find everything. I wasn't going to leave you in that hospital. Emily thought about the ER, Rosa at the nurse's station, Janet answering phones, Deshaun Williams going home with a healthy heart because someone had been paying attention. She thought about Mr. Hadley in room 12, the man who wouldn't ask for what he needed because he didn't want to be a burden. She had told Janet to make sure he had everything before he walked out. Did anyone stay with the hospital staff? She said, my colleagues, are they covered? We have people at Mercy General. Hargrove said, nobody there is a target. This is about you and what you know. What I know, Emily repeated quietly. And there it was, the thing that had lived in her chest for 3 years like a second heartbeat. The truth that the official report had summarized in factual, bloodless language that captured everything that happened and nothing that mattered. The thing that 12 people had died carrying and that Emily Carter had survived with and carried alone ever since. What she knew, the debrief, she said. Who's running it? Assistant Director Chen. She flew in from Langley 2 hours ago. Does she know the full file? Hargrove hesitated one fraction of a second too long. She has the official record. That's not what I asked. Emily, does she have the full file? Daniel, the actual file, not the version that was cleaned up for inter-agency review. Hargrove looked at the floor, then back at her. No, Emily absorbed that. Then the debrief is going to be interesting, she said. Reeves had been quiet during this exchange with the careful stillness of a man who understood he was hearing things he likely didn't have clearance for, and had chosen to stand his ground anyway because leaving felt like abandonment and staying felt like the right thing, and sometimes those were the only options available. Emily looked at him. You should go check on your patient, she said. Reeves looked back at her. He's got a full team on him, best monitoring available. He paused. I think I'll stay another minute. Something shifted in Emily's face. Not much, just enough. You're very stubborn for someone who trained under Kowalski, she said. Kowalski taught me that the most important moments in medicine happen outside the O, Reeves said. I'm starting to think that applies to other professions too. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to Harov. Take me to Chen. The debrief room was on the second floor, a rectangular space with a table and 8 chairs and a wall screen currently displaying a map of the Canadian board. Region with several locations marked in red. Assistant Director Margaret Chen was standing when Emily walked in, which Emily registered as either courtesy or assessment strategy. And Chen was the kind of woman who didn't do things accidentally, so probably both. Chen was 57 years old, compact and precise with silver-streaked hair pulled back without vanity and eyes that moved with the efficient inventory of someone who had spent 30 years reading people for a living. She looked at Emily the way you looked at a file you had studied extensively and were now seeing the original of for the first time. Major Carter, she said, or do you prefer? Emily is fine, Emily said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. Let's not perform this. Jen paused, then she sat down across from her. Fair enough, she folded her hands on the table. Director Morrison is alive because of what you did tonight. The agency is in your debt. Tell me about Orlov, Emily said. Chen looked at her for a moment, then she opened the folder in front of her. Vasily Orlov, age 44, confirmed FSB background, resigned or was pushed out in 2018. Timeline is murky. Since then our intelligence places him working private contracts, Eastern European clients, mostly with 2 confirmed kills in the last 30 months. Professional, patient, he doesn't rush. She looked up. He's been in the Chicago area for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Emily had been going to work reading her paperback, starting her IVs on the first attempt, eating vending machine sandwiches at 2:00 a.m., living her deliberately small and careful life. And Orlov had been 6 miles away for 6 weeks, watching, waiting, building whatever architecture of destruction he was constructing. What does he want? Emily said. We believe he wants the same thing he's always wanted, Chen said. To close the account. She looked at Emily steadily. He was the one who burned the road on your mission 3 years ago. The room went very quiet. Emily had known this. She had known it without evidence, without confirmation, in the way you knew certain things when you had been in enough dark places to recognize their specific shape. She had written it in her journal 3 years ago, the real journal, not the one with the forward sentences, the other one, the one she kept in a locked box at the back of her closet. She had written it and then written beneath it, I have no proof and the people who could provide proof are dead. You've known, Emily said. It wasn't a question. Chen met her eyes without flinching. We've suspected for approximately 18 months, confirming it took time. 18 months, Emily said, and nobody thought to tell me. You were in cover, Chen said. Contact would have 18 months, Emily said again. And her voice was still controlled, still level, but something underneath it had the specific quality of compression, of pressure building in an enclosed space. And Chen heard it clearly and did not look away from it. You're angry, Chen said. I'm accurate, Emily said. There's a difference. Chen looked at her for a long moment, then she did something Emily hadn't expected. She closed the folder, she set her pen down. She looked at Emily with something that wasn't bureaucratic assessment anymore, something that was closer to honest. You're right, Chen said. The decision to keep you uninformed was wrong. It was made by people who were balancing operational security against your personal safety, and they weighted the scale incorrectly. She paused. I'm telling you that directly because I think you deserve direct. Emily looked at her. What else are you not telling me directly? Chen breathed in. Orlov isn't working alone. We have strong indicators of a second asset, someone with access to domestic infrastructure, someone who has been inside this operation from the beginning. She met Emily's eyes. Someone who was also on the mission roster 3 years ago. The information hit Emily like a physical thing. She had come back from that mission carrying 12 deaths, and a story she couldn't fully tell, and 3 years of night shifts and paperback novels, and the private daily ritual of writing 4 words in a journal to confirm she was still herself. She had built her quiet life on the bedrock assumption that the catastrophe was behind her, that it was a wound she was carrying, not a fire still burning. She had been wrong. Who? She said. We don't have a confirmed identity yet. Chen said. We have a profile, communication patterns, a methodology. She paused. The second asset has access to your personnel file, your cover identity, your address. Another pause. Your schedule at Mercy General Hospital. Emily was very still. They knew where I was, yes, for how long, potentially the full 3 years, the full 3 years. Every shift, every break room, every night, driving home in the dark on empty Chicago streets, thinking she had made herself invisible, thinking she had successfully become no one, thinking the past was staying where she had buried and someone had known. Someone had been watching the coordinates of her small, careful life from a distance for 3 years for reasons she now understood with a clarity that was almost physically painful. They hadn't moved on her because they needed her for something, because she was more useful as bait than as a target, because there was something she knew, something she had witnessed on that mission, something that existed in her memory, and nowhere else, now that everyone else was dead. And whatever that something was, it was worth more to them as leverage than her death was worth as a termination. You need what I know, Emily said. Yes, Chen said simply. About what happened, the full account, what I saw before the extraction went wrong. Yes, and you think Orlov and the second asset are running this operation to prevent me from telling you. That's our current assessment. Emily looked at the map on the wall, the red markers, the Canadian border. Morrison's blood on an operating table 40 minutes ago. 12 names she had been carrying for 3 years that now had a different weight, a different meaning because they hadn't died in a failed operation. They had been murdered, and the person who had murdered them had been inside the wire from the beginning. There's something you should understand about what I know, Emily said. Chen waited. I've never told anyone the full account, Emily said. Not in the official debrief, not in the psych evaluations. Not to Harov? She looked directly at Chen because the full account doesn't just tell you what happened on that mission. It tells you who was in the room when the orders were given. It tells you who knew the route before it was burned. She paused. It goes further up than you were prepared for. Chen was very still. How far up? Far enough. Emily said that when I decided to disappear into an ER in Chicago and read paperback novels for 3 years, it wasn't just grief and survivor's guilt driving that decision. She held Chen's gaze. It was the calculation that the people who needed me quiet had the resources to make me quiet, and the only protection I had was being somewhere unremarkable enough that moving on me would cost more than leaving me alone. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Chen said, and now Morrison is alive, Emily said. And Orlov is in Chicago, and whoever the second asset is, they know I'm no longer in my ER reading my paperback. She leaned forward slightly. My cover is blown, my calculation is obsolete. The only thing that changes anything now is getting what I know into the right hands before Orlov or his partner gets to me first. Then tell me, Chen said. Emily looked at her. She looked at the folder on the table, the map on the wall, the door that led back to the corridor where Harov was waiting. And then she looked at her own hands, clean, now no blood on them, the hands that had written a classified protocol and performed an impossible surgery and turned pages of old paperback novels for 3 years in a break room where nobody saw her. Before I tell you anything, Emily said, I need to know one thing. Ask. Morrison knew the mission was burned before it launched, Emily said. He told me 40 minutes before we went wheels up. He pulled me aside and he said the intelligence had a problem and we might be walking into something that wasn't what it looked like. I asked him if we should abort. He said no. Her voice was steady and absolute. I need to know why he said no. I need to know what he knew that made him send 12 people into an operation he already suspected was compromised. Chen looked at her for a very long time. Outside somewhere in the facility, a door opened and closed. Footsteps moved down a hallway and faded. The building breathed its recycled air and hummed its classified hum. And somewhere on the floor below, the man who had sent 12 people into a burning operation was lying in a recovery bay, kept alive by the skill of the one person who had walked out. I don't know the answer to that question, Chen said finally. Then we have a problem, Emily said. Because the answer to that question is the center of everything I know. And everything I know is the center of whatever Orlov is trying to prevent you from hearing. Chen looked at her. You think Morrison knows who the second asset is? I think Morrison has always known, Emily said quietly. I think that's the actual reason someone tried to kill him tonight. Not to silence what I know, to silence what he does. The map on the wall showed red markers. Chicago, the Canadian border. Points on a line connecting events that had been building for 3 years in the dark, patient and deliberate, while Emily Carter turned pages in a break room and wrote 4 words in a journal every morning and tried very hard to be someone who didn't know what she knew. Chen reached for her phone. I need to restrict access to Morrison's recovery bay immediately. Yes, Emily said you do. If the second asset has domestic infrastructure, they may already have someone inside this facility. Emily said, that's not a possibility, that's a probability based on what I know about how this operation was built. She stood up, which means we have approximately as long as it takes someone to notice that Morrison is stable and conscious before the situation changes. Chen was already dialing. She looked up at Emily. Where are you going? To see Morrison, Emily said before anyone else does. She walked to the door. She opened it. Harov was in the corridor and he looked at her face, and read it the way he had always been able to read her face, which was one of the reasons she had liked him. And one of the reasons she had avoided him for 3 years, because people who could read you were people who could find you, Emily. And he said what happened in there, we're out of time, she said, come with me. And she was already moving back down the bright corridor, toward the recovery bay, toward the man who had sent her into the fire and lived to become the last. The answer she had been carrying alone for 3 years, toward the truth that 12 people had died to protect or expose or complicate, toward the ending of a story that had been building since long before, for a Black Hawk landed on a rooftop in Chicago, and soldiers walked into an demanding her by rank. Behind her, Hargrove fell into step ahead of her a door, and beyond the door a man who was alive because of her hands, and who owed her at minimum the truth. The recovery bay door had a keypad lock and a posted guard, a young soldier who straightened when he saw Emily coming down the corridor with Hargrove half a step behind her. The soldier looked at Emily, looked at Hargrove, looked at the expression on Emily's face and made the correct instinctive decision that this was not a moment to ask for identification. He stepped aside. Emily pushed through the door. Morrison was awake. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected sedation, the heavy chemical sleep of post-operative recovery, a man barely present behind a wall of morphine and monitored breathing. Instead, Alan Morrison was lying at a 30 degrees incline with his eyes open and tracking, gray-faced and diminished against the white of the bed, but cognitively present in a way that told her his mind had been fighting its way back to the surface for some time. The ventilator had been removed. He was breathing on his own. The monitors above him showed numbers that were careful and hard-won and real. He looked at her when she came through the door and something happened in his face that she hadn't seen in 3 years. Recognition, and underneath recognition something older and heavier and more complicated. Relief. Carter, he said. His voice was rough, stripped down, the voice of a man who had been very close to having no voice at all. I knew they'd find you. You sent them, Emily said. He pulled a chair to the side of his bed and sat down and looked at him directly the way she had always looked at him, without the performance of difference that most people extended to men of his position. Morrison had never wanted that from her and she had never offered it. It was one of the things that had made them functional together. Before you lost consciousness, you said, fine, Carter. Yes, because of the surgery. Because of everything. Morrison said he tried to shift position and the effort cost him visibly. Emily reached forward without thinking and adjusted the angle of his pillow with the automatic competence of someone who had spent years managing patient comfort. Morrison looked at her hands. 3 years in an ER, he said quietly. I heard. You knew where I was. Yes, Emily had expected this. She had already worked through it in the quarter outside Shen's debrief room. But hearing it confirmed, hearing it in his voice landed differently than the intellectual preparation for it. The whole time, she said. From the second month, Morrison said. We had a flag on your alias documentation. When it activated in Chicago, I was notified. He met her eyes. I didn't move on it. I didn't send it anyone. I left you where you were. Why? Morrison was quiet for a moment. The monitors above him beeped their steady rhythm. Because you had earned it, he said. Right to draw up here, the right to be somewhere quiet. A pause. And because I knew that if I made contact, I would have to tell you things I wasn't ready to tell you. Things I owed you. His voice dropped. Things I've owed you for 3 years. Emily leaned forward slightly. Then tell me now. Morrison looked at the ceiling. Then he looked back at her, and whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes completed itself, and he began the mission 3 years ago. He said the extraction op near the border. You know the official record. Equipment failure, enemy contact, ambush during exfil. He paused. You know the official record is incomplete. I know the official record is a lie. Emily said, tell me the TR. The root was burned from inside. Morrison said, not by Orlov. Orlov was the instrument, not the source. The source was someone with access to the full operational package, someone who had been positioned inside the mission architecture for months before the op launched. He looked at her. Someone I trusted. Who? Morrison said a name. Emily went completely still. The name Morrison said was not Orlov. It was not a foreign asset or an enemy contractor, or anyone Emily had considered in 3 years of private reconstruction of the events of that day. It was a name she knew. A name attached to a face she had seen across briefing tables and in secure communications and in the institutional corridors of the kind of work that didn't have a public profile. It was a name attached to someone who was currently inside this facility. He's here, Emily said. The words came out flat and certain. Right now in this building? Yes, Morrison said. He's been embedded in the response team since the beginning of this operation. I didn't know until 4 hours before I was hit. His voice tightened. I was moving to expose him when Orlov took the shot. Emily stood up, her chair scraped back. Her mind was moving at a speed that felt almost external to her body, pulling information and assembling it with the same systematic precision she brought to a chest cavity, identifying the architecture of the problem, mapping its geometry. That's why the timing, she said, wasn't just contracted to kill you. He was protecting an asset who was about to be exposed. Yes, and the asset knows you survived. She looked at the door, and the asset knows I'm here. Emily, how many people know which room you're in right now? Morrison looked at her. The recovery team, Hargrove, Chen, and whoever the asset has been feeding information to, Emily said. She turned to Hargrove, who had been standing at the door throughout this exchange with the expression of a man absorbing information at a rate that was at the very edge of his processing capacity. Hargrove, who assigned the security detail on this room. Hargrove thought for exactly 1 second. Deputy Director Wallace coordinated the facility security. Emily looked at him. Wallace, she said carefully. Emily Wallace has been with the agency for what's his full name. Hargrove stared at her. Richard Wallace. Emily turned back to Morrison. Is that the name? Morrison met her eyes. Yes. The corridor outside was quiet. The building hummed somewhere 2 floors up. Chen was on her phone, restricting access to this recovery bay. And Deputy Director Richard Wallace, who had coordinated the facility security, who had positioned every guard, who had designed every protocol protecting the man in this room, was somewhere inside these walls. We have to move him, Emily said. He just came out of major thoracic surgery. Hargrove said, you performed the surgery. You know what moving him risks. Emily said, and her voice was harder now, stripped down to its operational core, is considerably less than what leaving him in a room whose security architecture was designed by the man trying to kill him. She looked at Hargrove. Can you get a transport team? You trust people Wallace didn't assign. Hargrove pulled out his phone. His hands were steady. This was what Emily had always valued about Hargrove, that when things moved fast, he moved with them without the ego friction of needing to be the person driving. I have 2 people, he said. They came in with me on the helicopter. Wallace doesn't know them. Get them here, Emily said. Now quietly, Hargrove stepped into the quarter to make the call. Emily turned back to Morrison. He was watching her with the expression she remembered from briefing rooms years ago. The look of a man who had deployed her into hard situations and trusted her read on the terrain completely. That trust had cost 12 people their lives and cost Emily 3 years of her own. She looked at it now and felt its weight differently than she had in the corridor outside Chen's debrief room. Not as betrayal, as something more complicated, as a specific weight of a man who had made a wrong decision for reasons that were not entirely wrong. Why didn't you abort the mission? Emily said, when you knew the intelligence had a problem. Morrison closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were tired in a way that went past physical exhaustion. Because I didn't know yet that Wallace was the source, he said. I knew the intelligence had been touched. I thought it was a foreign penetration. I thought if we ran the op, we might identify the leak from the other end. His voice was rough. I was wrong about how wrong I was. 12 people, Emily said. Yes, Morrison said. 12 people every day. He looked at her. And you, what you've been carrying alone, that's on me too. Emily looked at him for a long time. The monitors beeped. The room breathed. Outside the door, Hargrove's voice was low and rapid in the corridor. When this is over, E. Miley said finally. We're going to have a longer conversation about that. I know, Morrison said, but right now you need to do exactly what I tell you, she said, because your surgeon is also apparently the only person in this building who currently understands the full threat picture, which is not a situation I designed, but here we are. Something moved across Morrison's face that in different circumstances might have been amusement. You always did have a gift for understatement, he said. Conserve your energy, Emily said. We're moving you in approximately 4 minutes. Hargo came back through the door. My people are 3 minutes out. Stairwell B, which Wallace didn't wire for additional coverage because it accesses the loading dock and he considered it low priority. He paused. Emily Chen needs to know about Wallace right now. Call her, Emily said, but don't use the facility's internal system. Use your personal phone. Hargrove looked at her. You think the internal communications are compromised? I think a man who has been running a penetration operation for 3 years and is currently embedded in a response team inside this building has had ample time and motivation to compromise anything he could reach. Emily said, so yes, personal phone. Tell her the name, tell her to lock down quietly, no facility-wide alerts. Harrove dialed. Emily moved to the window not to look out. There was nothing visible in the dark. But because standing near the door meant being visible through the narrow glass panel when anyone walked past, and she had already shifted instinctively into the spatial calculation of someone who had been trained to understand sightlines and exposure. She heard Harrove say Chen's name. She heard him say Wallace's name. She heard the pause that followed. And she didn't need to hear Chen's response to know what it contained, because she had felt the same thing herself 30 seconds ago. That specific quality of a foundational assumption collapsing the ground, shifting under a structure you had built on top of it without questioning whether it was solid. Then she heard Harrove say something she didn't expect. Chen, he said, and his voice changed. Chen, are you? Another pause. Answer me. Emily turned around. Hargrove was staring at his phone with an expression she recognized and did not want to recognize. The call dropped, he said. Dropped or cut, Emily said. They looked at each other. Move, Emily said. She went to Morrison's bed and began disconnecting monitors with the swift, practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly which leads were attached to machines that mattered and which ones were attached to alarms that would sound the moment they were removed. Morrison watched her work without speaking. His breathing was controlled and careful, the breathing of a managing pain through discipline. And Emily registered it and filed it and kept moving. The vasopressor line stays in, she said, half to Morrison and half to herself. The arterial line too, everything else comes off. Harrove, I need the portable monitor from the crash cart in the corner. Harrove was already moving. He brought the monitor. Emily transferred the arterial line lead in one smooth motion and the numbers jumped to the portable screen and held. 84 systolic. Enough, it had to be enough. Can you sit? She asked Morrison. Yes, he said, then do it. She helped him upright, one arm under his shoulders, and she felt the effort it cost him in the rigidity of his body, the controlled suppression of what was obviously significant pain. I know it hurts, she said quietly. Keep breathing. I've been shot, Morrison said through his teeth. I know how to breathe through pain. You've been shot and then surgically opened and then sutured back together in a procedure that most surgeons considered impossible, Emily said. So give yourself permission to acknowledge that this is not a standard recovery situation. Are you always this direct with your patients, only the ones who send Blackhawks for me? Harrove had the door open. He looked left and right down the corner with the quick trained assessment of someone checking an angle. Clear, he said. Emily had Morrison on his feet. He was unsteady and she felt it, the slight forward lean. That meant his pressure was adjusting to vertical and his body was not entirely happy about it. And she put her left arm around his back and her right hand on his forearm, and she became for the second time that night the structure between a man and the floor. They moved into the corridor. It was empty. The overhead lights were the standard institutional fluorescent, steady and indifferent, and their footsteps were the only sound. As they moved towards stairwell B at the end of the corridor, Emily counted doors as they passed. 432, and then a door behind them opened. She heard it without turning, the specific soft click of a security door releasing, and she felt Morrison register it too, the slight tension that moved through his body against her arm. Keep walking, she said quietly. Don't turn around. Harrove ahead of them turned. He stopped. Emily heard him say very quietly, Richard. She stopped walking. She turned Morrison so his back was against the wall, which put the portable monitor between him and the corridor and gave her a clear line between herself and whatever was behind her. So then she turned around. Deputy Director Richard Wallace was standing 12 ft away in the corridor. He was 60 years old, silver-haired, with the patrician bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades being one of the most trusted people in rooms where trust was the only currency. He was wearing the kind of expression that had probably served him in those rooms for 40 years, measured and calm and authoritative. The expression that said, whatever is happening here, I am the adult managing it. But his right hand was at his side and it was not empty. Emily, he said with the specific tone of someone who was genuinely disappointed. I had hoped you'd stay in the debrief room long enough for this not to be necessary. Emily looked at him. She looked at what was in his hand. She calculated the distance, the angles, the 3 people in the corridor, the door behind Wallace, the stairwell door 20 ft behind her. She did all of this in approximately 2 seconds. Then she said, Where's Chen's safe? Wallace said, temporarily unavailable. He took one step forward. You understand that this isn't personal. It's personal to the 12 people who died, Emily said. Something moved across Wallace's face. Not guilt, something older and more settled than guilt. The expression of a man who had made his accommodation with the weight of his decisions long ago and was not interested in reopening the account. Casualties of a larger strategic necessity, he said. You were never supposed to be one of them, Emily. You were too valuable. That's why you let me disappear, she said. Not because you couldn't find me, because I was more useful alive. You were more useful not asking questions, Wallace said, which you managed remarkably well for 3 years. He paused, until tonight made that position untenable. Because Morrison was going to expose you, because Morrison made a series of sentimental decisions that compromised the integrity of an operation that has taken 15 years to build. Wallace said, and for the first time the measured tone fractured slightly, something harder and more genuine coming through the surface. He chose personal loyalty over strategic necessity. And this is the result. Hargrove had not moved. He was standing between Wallace and Emily could see his hands, could see the set of his shoulders, and she read in his body the specific quality of a man who was about to do something and was making the final calculation about when. Daniel, she said quietly. Oh, Hargrove looked at her. He's not going to use that here, Emily said, keeping her eyes on Wallace. Because using it here ends everything he's built. One shot in a federal medical facility with 12 security cameras and the paperwork becomes unmanageable regardless of how many assets you have. She looked at Wallace directly. You came here to extract Morrison, not to shoot people in a corridor. Wallace looked at her with something approaching genuine appraisal. You're correct, he said. Which is why I'm asking you to step aside. No, Emily said. The word was simple and complete and it fell into the corridor like something with mass. Wallace looked at her. Emily, you burned my unit, she said. Flat, direct. You sent 12 people into an operation you had compromised and you watched them die because it was strategically necessary. You let me carry that alone for 3 years. You let me believe it was a failure, an accident, a thing I should have prevented. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. And now you're standing in this corridor asking me to step aside. She looked at him. No. The stairwell door behind Emily burst open. 2 soldiers came through it fast. Harrow's people in the quarter reorganized itself in the space of 3 seconds, and Wallace looked at the 2 soldiers and looked at Emily and looked at Hargrove and performed the same calculation. And Emily had performed 30 seconds earlier and he arrived at the same answer. Lowered his hand. This isn't over, he said. It is for tonight, Emily said, and tonight is enough. The soldiers moved to Wallace, and Harrop was already on his phone again, and Emily turned back to Morrison, who was still standing against the wall with his hand pressed to his side and his face the color of old paper, but his eyes were steady and present, and looking at her with an expression she had no immediate category for. You didn't step aside, he said. No, Emily said after everything. You're my patient, Emily said simply. She moved back to his side and put her arm under his shoulder, and I don't lose patience. She looked at the stairwell door. Can you ma? Nosh stairs. Morrison straightened as much as his body would allow. Watch me, he said. And Emily Carter, who had spent 3 years trying to be nobody, who had hidden her rank and her medals and her history in the bottom drawer of a locker in an ER where people threw her books, and looked through her like glass, guided the man who owed her the truth down a stairwell in a classified facility in Chicago while a Blackhawk waited on the roof. And a story that had cost 12 lives moved finally toward the light. The loading dock was cold and the concrete under their feet was uneven. And Morrison moved through it with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who understood that his body was operating on borrowed resources, and that borrowing had a cost he would pay later. Emily kept her arm under his shoulder and she matched his pace exactly. Not rushing him, not slowing to accommodate him, just moving with him the way she had learned to move with patients who were fighting their own bodies to stay upright. Finding the rhythm of what they could give and working inside it. Hargrove was ahead of them. His 2 soldiers flanked the rear. Wallace was contained and the quarter behind them was quiet, and for approximately 90 seconds the situation felt like something that could be managed. Then Harrove's phone buzzed. He looked at it. He stopped walking. Emily looked at his back. What? Harrove turned around. His face had the expression she had come to recognize over the course of this night as his version of delivering bad news. A particular tightening around the eyes, a controlled quality to his breathing. Orlaw, he said, he's been located thermal imaging from the surveillance drone that's been running over the facility perimeter for the last 40 minutes. He looked at her. He's inside the building. Morrison made a sound that was not quite a word. Emily processed the information in the 2 seconds it took her to look at the loading dock door, the stairwell they had come from, the 2 exits visible from where she stood. How long has the drone been running? Since we landed, Hargrove said. Then he was already inside before we arrived. Emily said he came in ahead of the response team. He used Wallace's access architecture to position himself. She looked at Harrove. Where exactly? 3rd floor northeast corner. Harrove looked at Morrison and back at Emily. That's directly above the original recovery bay. He didn't know we moved, Emily said. Not yet. The loading dock was silent for 3 seconds. Then Emily said, get Morrison to the helicopter right now. Don't stop, don't wait for me, don't look back. She looked at Harrove directly. Get him airborne and get him to a facility Wallace never touched. You know where that is. Hargrove looked at her. Emily, what are you? Orlov doesn't know Morrison has been moved. And she said, which means he's going to the original recovery bay, which means someone needs to be there when he arrives. She paused. And it can't be Morrison. It can't be you either, Hargrove said. You're a surgeon, not I know what I am, Emily said quietly. And she said it in a way that ended the sentence because the full truth of what she was, the complete answer to that question, had been the subject of an entire night, an entire 3 years, an entire chapter of a life she had tried to close and couldn't. And standing in a loading dock at 4 in the morning was not the moment to fully unpack it. Hargo looked at her for 3 full seconds, then he looked at his soldiers, then he looked at Morrison, then he looked back at Emily and he said something she hadn't expected. I should have come for you sooner, he said. Not tonight because of Morrison, before tonight just to tell you it wasn't your fault. Emily looked at him. Something moved through her chest that was too large and too complicated for this moment. Go, she said. Hargrove nodded once. He took Morrison's other side and they moved toward the exit, and Emily turned toward the stairwell door and she breathed once and she went back into the building. The third floor was 3 flights up. Emily took the stairs at a pace that was not running but was everything short of running, her hand on the rail, her feet finding the edges of the steps with automatic precision. Her body moving with the economic speed of someone who had covered ground under much worse conditions than this. The stairwell was fluorescent and echoing and completely empty, and her own footsteps were the loudest thing in it. She came out on the third floor corridor and stopped, listened. The floor had the quality of a space that had been recently evacuated, chairs pushed back from stations, a coffee cup still sitting on a counter, the residue of people who had left quickly. Chen's lockdown order had cleared the floor, which meant it was quiet, which meant that anything moving up here would be audible. She heard nothing. She moved toward the northeast corner. The original recovery bay was at the end of the corridor. Or closed. The posted guard position outside it now empty because the guard had been reassigned when Harrove's lockdown communication went through. The room beyond that door contained a bed that had been occupied 45 minutes ago by a man whose death Orlov had been contracted to confirm. The bed was now empty, or didn't know that yet. Emily moved along the wall, not the center of the corridor, and she was 12 ft from the recovery bay door when she heard it. Not movement, breathing. The specific control quality of someone who was managing their own sound output with professional discipline. Someone who had been trained the way she had been trained to understand that bodies made noise and noise got you killed. And so you managed the noise, you controlled the breaths, you moved like the absence of a person rather than a person. She stopped. She was not armed, she had nothing in her hands. She was a surgeon in scrubs who had been awake for 22 hours and had performed thoracic surgery and navigated a conspiracy and guided a post-operative patient down a stairwell. And she was standing in a corridor on the third floor of a classified facility with a professional assassin somewhere in the darkness ahead of her. She thought about the break room at Mercy General, the paperback novel on the table, the bookmark between pages 147 and 148, the 4 words she wrote in her journal every morning. Still here, still whole. Then she reached for the light panel on the wall beside her and she turned off the corridor lights. The floor went dark, and in the darkness, Emily Carter became something the break room at Mercy General had never seen. Not a nurse, not a surgeon, something older than both of those things, something that had been shaped in field hospitals and extraction zones. And the long specific education of operating in places where the difference between alive and dead was sometimes nothing more than who moved first and who hesitated. She moved not toward the recovery bay door, away from it, angling left, her back against the wall. Her feet finding the floor silently in the way she had been taught in training that felt like another lifetime and had never actually left her body. She could hear her own pulse. She controlled it. Slow breath in through the nose, out through the mouth. A technique she had used more times than she could count in more places than she wanted to remember. A sound ahead and left. The recovery bay door was moving. Orlov was going in. Emily moved toward the sound. She was 6 feet from the door when it swung open, and the figure coming through it collided with the reality that the room was empty, and the bed was empty, and the monitor was gone, and everything that should have been present was not. And in the half-second of recalibration that even the most disciplined professional experienced when the expected target was absent, Emily closed the remaining distance. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not something Emily would describe in detail later. Not to Chen, not to Harrove, not to the official debrief team that would spend 3 days trying to reconstruct the events of that night. What she would say was that her training had returned to her exactly when she needed it, and that Vasil Orlov was a professional and had reflexes that were genuinely dangerous, and that the outcome was not certain for any of the 4 seconds that lasted. What she would not say was that there was one moment approximately 2 seconds in when it could have gone the other way. When Orlov's training and her own were equal, when the outcome balanced on a single decision, and what tipped it was not superior skill or superior strength, but something much harder to quantify, a reason, a specific waited 3 years in the making reason to be standing in that corridor at 4 in the morning that Orlov simply did not have on his side of the equation. 12 names. She thought of them in that single decisive second, not abstractly, specifically. Sergeant David Rios, who had a daughter named Marisol, and a laugh that filled a room. Lieutenant Anna Kowalczyk, who read poetry in the field and was embarrassed about it and shouldn't have been. Captain James Tran, who had told Emily 2 hours before the mission launched that he had a bad feeling, and Emily had told him that bad feelings and good missions weren't mutually exclusive and she had been wrong. 12 names, 12 faces, 12 reasons. The outcome tipped. When the quarter lights came back on, triggered by the motion sensors that had been cycling through their automatic reset, Vasily Orlov was on the floor with his hands secured behind him, using the fabric strip Emily had taken from the supply room she had passed on her way up the stairs. Because 3 years in an ER had trained her to notice supplies, the way combat had trained her to improvise with whatever was available. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. Her left shoulder, where the old shrapnel scar lived, was informing her in specific and emphatic terms that she had used it in ways the scar tissue did not appreciate. She pressed her hand against it and breathed through it and looked down at Orlov, who was conscious and still and looking up at her with a professional assessment of someone cataloging what had just happened and what it meant for his situation. The second asset is in custody. Emily said she wasn't talking to Orlov. She was talking to the corridor to the facility, to whoever was listening through whatever systems were still functioning. And Orlov is secured on the third floor northeast corridor. I need 2 people up here right now. A door at the far end of the corridor opened. 2 soldiers came through it at a run, and Emily recognized neither of them and held her ground until she could see their credentials and confirm they were Chen's people and not Wallace's. And then she stepped back and let them take custody. And she walked to the wall and put her back against it and stood there for a moment with her hand on her shoulder and her eyes closed. She thought about Morrison in a helicopter moving over the dark grid of Chicago towards somewhere safe. She thought about Harov beside him, steady and capable and guilty in the specific useful way of a man who intended to do something about his guilt. She thought about Chen, who had been temporarily unavailable in a way that had turned out to mean locked in a supply closet on the second floor by one of Wallace's assets, and who had been located and freed 12 minutes ago, according to the brief text Harov had sent her on the stairs, and who was now almost certainly the most comprehensively furious person in the state of Illinois. She thought about Richard Wallace, 60 years old, silver-haired, 40 years of trust accumulated and spent in the service of something he had convinced himself was larger than the people it destroyed. She thought about how people did that, how they built the architecture of justification, the strategic necessity, the larger picture, the acceptable loss, how they looked at 12 human beings and converted them into variables in an equation. And how the conversion was not a single dramatic moral failure, but a slow erosion, a series of small accommodations, each one making the next one easier until the man who had once been someone who cared was someone who had simply forgot how she thought about herself. 3 years of paperback novels and forward journal entries and the deliberate construction of invisibility. She had judged Wallace for his accommodation. She understood now, standing in this quarter at 4 in the morning with a scar aching and a man zip-tied on the floor, that her own 3-year accommodation had its own costs. That the people at Mercy General who had worked beside her and never fully known her and her had deserved more than a colleague who was present in body and absent in truth. That Rosa Mendes, who had figured out something real about her and said so with kindness, had deserved a real answer instead of a quiet confirmation on the way out the door. That Deshaun Williams, whose heart she had saved by being a person who paid attention, had deserved to know who was paying attention. She opened her eyes, she took her hand off her shoulder, she looked at the quarter clean and lit and empty now, and she thought about what came next. The debrief, the full account finally given to the right person in the right room with the right protections in place. 12 names entered into an official record that would finally say what happened to them and why and whose decision it was. Wallace in a room that his own access credentials no longer opened. Orlov in a room that had nothing comfortable in it. Morrison in a hospital bed somewhere that nobody had compromised, healing slowly, and owing her a conversation she fully intended to have. And then she hadn't thought past then. For 3 years the plan had been to have no plan, to maintain the small daily structure of shifts and breaks in novels and forward sentences, to make the future nothing more than the accumulation of ordinary days. It had been a plan built on the premise that the past was behind her. That premise was now thoroughly, irreversibly retired. So then what? She was still standing in that quarter thinking about it when her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She answered it anyway. Emily Chen's voice, dry and direct and carrying the specific edge of a woman who had spent 45 minutes in a supply closet and was not going to let that go unrest. Are you in one piece? Mostly, Emily said. Orlov is secured. I assume your people have him. They do. Wallace is en route to a federal holding facility. A pause. I've been told what happened in that corridor. What you did. I secured a target. Emily said. You took down a professional contractor with your bare hands while recovering from a 20-hour shift that included major thoracic surgery. Chen said. Don't minimize it. I had reasons, Emily said simply. I know you did. Chen's voice softened fractionally. 12 of them. A pause. I want the full debrief when you're gay. Not tonight. You've done enough for tonight. Emily leaned her head back against the wall. Chen Morrison told me he knew the mission was compromised before it launched. He made a decision that cost 12 people their lives. I need that in the record. A silence. I understand. I'm not asking for a prosecution, Emily said. I'm asking for the truth on record, officially, with their names attached to what actually happened to them. You'll have it, Chen said. I promise you that personally. Emily believed her. She didn't know Chen well enough to explain why she believed her, but she did. Some people's word had a specific quality that you recognized when you heard it. Something that had nothing to do with rank or institution and everything to do with the person underneath both of those things. Chen had that quality. Emily had learned over years to trust that recognition. Thank you, Emily said. Get some sleep, Chen said. Somewhere that isn't a classified facility. A pause, and Emily, the agency owes you more than a debrief. That conversation will happen too. The call ended. Emily stood in the corridor alone for another minute. Then she started walking back toward the stairwell down the stairs. She had come up 40 minutes ago, moving toward danger and coming back down, moving away from it, which was its own kind of symmetry. The loading dock was empty. The cold air outside was the same cold air that had hit her face coming off the helicopter. How many hours ago now? A different person almost, or the same person with something finally returned to her that she hadn't let herself know was missing. She stood in the cold and she breathed it, and she thought about Rosa Mendes standing at the nurse's station saying that women's secrets got secrets. She pulled out her phone. It was 5:47 in the morning. The night shift at Mercy General ended at 7:00. She knew without looking at a schedule that Rosa would be there until 7:00, that Janet would be finishing her charts. That Mr. Hadley in room 12 had almost certainly gone home hours ago with his prescription and his follow-up appointment written down on a card, because Janet was the kind of person who did what she was asked. She knew that Marcus Webb would be somewhere in that building, in the specific post-adrenaline state of a man who had watched his entire framework for understanding the people around him collapse in one night, and that he would be doing what people like him did after that kind of collapse, which was either doubling down or beginning the slow, painful work of rebuilding something better. She didn't know which one he would choose. She had said what she had to say to him. 3 years of night shifts. She had said it with every precise IV and every caught diagnosis and every quiet, dignified response to his worst behavior. And eventually people heard what you said with your actions, or they didn't. And that was a door he had to open himself. She thought about the break room, the table by the door, her novel still sitting there. She imagined bookmark in place, pages 147 and 148 waiting. She had been in the middle of a chapter about a detective who knew more than she was saying, and was keeping quiet for reasons that made sense to her even when they made no sense to anyone else. She thought that was probably enough of that particular genre for a while. At 6:04 in the morning, with the Chicago skyline pale and beginning against the dark to the east, a car pulled up to the loading dock and Harrove got out of the passenger seat. He looked at her across the hood of the car. He looked at her shoulder where she was pressing her hand again without having noticed she'd started doing it. Morrison is secured, he said. Good facility, good people. He's going to be in recovery for weeks, but he's going to be in recovery. He came around the car. Chen called me. I know, she said. You need sleep. I need 12 things. Emily said. Sleep is probably 4th or 5th on the list. Hargrove stopped in front of her. He was tired in a way that lived in his bones. The exhaustion of a long night and a longer 3 years. And he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, which was directly and without pretense. Where do you want to go? He said. Emily thought about that. It was a larger question than it sounded. Her apartment in Evanston was a cover that was blown. Her locker at Mercy General had a journal in the bottom drawer that she probably didn't need to keep writing the same 4 words in anymore. Her life for 3 years had been built to fit inside a space that no longer existed, and the question of where she wanted to go was really a question about what came next, about who Emily Carter was going to be now that the architecture of her disappearance had been fully and permanently dismantled. I need to go back to Mercy General first, she said. Hargrove looked at her. Emily, not to work. He said, there are people there who deserve better than what I gave them for 3 years. She paused, and I left a book on a table. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do in the entire length of the night. He smiled, not broadly, just enough. Okay, he said, Mercy General first. They got in the car. The drive back into the city took 22 minutes, and Emily spent most of it looking out the window at Chicago coming awake in the early morning. Gray delivery trucks and early commuters, and the specific quality of light that belonged to the hour before full dawn, when the city was neither one thing nor the other but something in between. She had driven this route hundreds of times in 3 years. She had always driven it alone in the dark, going home, going away. This was the first time she had driven it towards something. They pulled up in front of Mercy General at 6:31. The ambulance bay was quiet. The ER entrance lights were on. Through the glass doors, Emily could see the nurse's station in the familiar geometry of the floor she had worked for 3 years, 2 months and 11 days. She got out of the car. She pushed through the doors. Rosa Mendes looked up from the nurse's station. She looked at Emily's scrubs and her shoulder and her face in the specific way that Rosa looked at things, the way that saw past the surface into the structure underneath. Her eyes went bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent overhead lights. Girl, Rosa said softly, you came back. I came back, Emily said. She crossed the floor. She stood at the nurse's station and she looked at Rosa and she said, you were right. Whatever you figured out, you were right. I know I was right, Rosa said. I just wanted you to know that I knew. She paused. Are you okay? Emily thought about that honestly. Her shoulder hurt. She had been awake for 23 hours. The full debrief was ahead of her. And the full account of 3 years and 12 names in a mission that should have been aborted was ahead of her. And whatever came after all of that was ahead of her, in a future that would genuinely, uncomplicatedly open in a way that her future had not been open in a very long time. I'm going to be, she said. Rosa came around the nurse's station and she did something entirely without ceremony. She just put her arms around Emily and held on. And Emily stood in the middle of the Mercy General ER at 6:32 in the morning and let herself be held, which was harder than anything she had done all night, and also in some way she couldn't fully articulate more important. Behind her she heard footsteps. She turned. Marcus Webb was standing in the corridor entrance. He was still in his scrubs from the previous shift, which meant he had stayed, and his face looked like a man who had spent several hours sitting with something uncomfortable and had made a decision about it. He looked at Emily. He looked at Rosa. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at Emily. "I owe you an apology," he said. Emily looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you do." He had probably expected something else, a deflection or a generous dismissal. The kind of graceful minimizing that people sometimes offered when they sensed an apology was coming, a way of easing the other person's discomfort. Emily didn't offer it. She stood and she received his words at full value, and she waited. "I treated you as if you were invisible," Marcus said, "as if you were less than what you are." He paused. "You are more than anything I assumed you were," and he stopped, started again. "I was wrong, I'm sorry." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "You know why I never fought back," she said. He shook his head. "Because I was trying to be invisible," she said. "That was my choice, my decision, my reason. You don't get credit for my silence." She paused. "But you do get credit for standing here right now. That's yours." She looked at him steadily. "Don't waste it." Marcus Webb stood in the corridor of his ER and nodded. Something in his face was different from the face he had worn for 3 years of night shifts and belittled nurses and performed authority. Something had been removed or had removed itself, and what was underneath it was younger and less certain and considerably more honest. "The cardiac tampon nod," he said. "Deshaun Williams, I never acknowledged what you did." "No," Emily said, "you saved his life." "Yes," she said, "because I was paying attention." She let that sit for a moment, and that's all it was. Marcus paying attention to the person in front of you. She looked at him. "Try it, it changes everything." She walked to the break room, the table by the door. The paperback novel was exactly where she had left it, bookmarked between pages 147 and 148. The cover slightly worn, the spine creased from years of reading. She picked it up. She held it for a moment, then she set it back down. She didn't need it anymore. Not because the story wasn't worth finishing, because she had her own story to finish. And it was considerably more interesting, and it required her full attention from this point forward. She walked back out to the nurse's station. She stood in front of Rosa. "I'll be back," she said. "Not tomorrow, but eventually." "I know you will," Rosa said, "because you're the best nurse this floor ever had." She paused. "Even if that apparently wasn't exactly what you were." Emily looked at her. "It was exactly what I was," she said. "While I was here, it was exactly what I was." She walked back through the ER, past the bay where she had caught Beck's triad developing in a 17-year-old's chest, past the nurse's station where she had been invisible for 3 years and seen everything, past the break room doorway where a book was sitting on a table with a bookmark in it waiting. She pushed through the front doors. The morning air was cold and real, and Chicago was fully awake now, moving and loud and indifferent in the way that cities were indifferent, which was not unkind but simply large. Harov's car was at the curb. She got in. "Ready," he said. Emily looked through the windshield at the city ahead of her, at the open, unarchitectured, genuinely unknown future that waited on the other side of a debrief, and a full account and 12 names finally placed into an honest record. "Yes," she said, and she meant it completely. Because Major Emily Carter had spent 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days being the woman nobody saw, the quiet one in the corner. The person you look through without knowing what you were missing, and she had done it well, and she had done it for reasons that made sense at the time, and now that time was finished. The people who had tried to keep her invisible were in custody. The people she had been trying to protect were safe. And the woman climbing into that car in the early morning light outside a Chicago emergency room was not hiding from anything anymore. She was, for the first time in a very long time, simply herself. And that was more than enough.